She should be grateful we still invite her anywhere. Sibella whispered loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, while lifting a crystal glass toward the candlelight. Laughter rippled outward from the center of the Ashgrove family table, like poison dropped into still water. Venetia Ashgrove sat perfectly still near the far end of the dining arrangement, her fingers resting motionless against her napkin, while humiliation spread like heat across her collarbones. Around her, the annual Hargreave Winter Ball continued in full spectacle. Hundreds of candles burned from iron chandeliers overhead, casting golden light across marble floors and silk gowns and the jeweled throats of women who had spent weeks preparing for this single evening. Margot leaned toward Cosima, with exaggerated sympathy painted across her mouth. Poor Venetia. A full year since the Duke cast her aside, and still no suitor brave enough to risk the association. Cosima covered her laugh behind a gloved hand. Can you blame them? No gentleman wants a woman already rejected by the most powerful man in England. Damaged goods carry no value at auction. Lord Pemberton Ashgrove did not correct his daughters. He sat rigidly at the head of the table, carving roasted venison without looking once in Venetia's direction, convinced that ignoring her long enough might eventually erase the embarrassment she represented. Venetia lowered her eyes toward the untouched plate before her. Braised lamb, honeyed parsnips, and winter greens arranged beautifully on painted porcelain. She could not taste any of it. The humiliation was too thick inside her throat. Then Margot delivered the final strike with perfect timing. You know, sister, I hear Lord Berenger's elderly uncle recently lost his 3rd wife. Perhaps father could arrange an introduction. Even widowers deserve companionship. The laughter that followed spread beyond the family table. Nearby guests turned with curious amusement, while Venetia's hands began trembling beneath the tablecloth. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and prepared to stand, to excuse herself before the burning behind her eyes became visible. And then the ballroom doors opened. The sound hit the room before the announcement did. Heavy oak doors swinging wide against stone walls, followed by the sharp crack of a herald's staff striking marble. His Grace, Duke Corwin Blackthorne of Halford. Every voice in the ballroom stopped at once. Silverware froze against porcelain. Music stumbled into silence mid-waltz. 300 guests turned simultaneously toward the entrance, where a tall figure stepped through the doorway, carrying the kind of authority that made crowded rooms feel suddenly small. Venetia's breath disappeared from her lungs. Standing beneath the chandelier light, wearing a dark coat that absorbed the gold surrounding him, was the man who had destroyed her life exactly 1 year ago, and he was staring directly at her. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now let us begin. Long before that night changed everything, Venetia Ashgrove had learned to make herself useful in ways nobody acknowledged. The Ashgrove estate sat wide and proud across the hills of Carvingham, its pale stone walls covered with ivy that darkened each autumn and returned green every spring. Inside, corridors stretched endlessly beneath vaulted ceilings, painted with pastoral scenes of shepherdesses and angels, and golden sunlight that never quite matched the grayness pressing against the windows outside. Fireplaces tall enough for a man to stand inside crackled throughout the house during winter months, filling the halls with the scent of burning oak and dried lavender bundled between the logs. The estate required enormous effort to maintain. And quietly, without recognition or gratitude, Venetia carried most of that weight. Every morning she rose before the rest of the household, reviewing kitchen ledgers with the head cook while bread baked in the stone ovens below the main hall. She inspected linens, managed supply orders from the village, resolved disputes between housemates, and ensured visiting guests received proper rooms with fresh flowers and warmed blankets before their carriages even reached the front gates. When the estate hosted gatherings, which happened frequently given Lord Pemberton's obsession with social positioning, Venetia organized seating arrangements, supervised table settings, confirmed musicians, and coordinated menus that often stretched across 5 courses. Nobody thanked her. Her sisters moved through the manor as though the comfort surrounding them appeared by magic. Sibella spent mornings reading French novels beside the drawing-room fire, calling for tea every 40 minutes, without once wondering who prepared it. Margot practiced piano in the east parlor, while maids polished the instrument around her, never receiving a word of acknowledgement. Cosima slept until noon most days, then complained loudly about whichever detail failed to meet her expectations. The household staff understood the truth, even if the family refused to see it. Venetia was the spine holding the estate upright, while everyone else decorated the surface. One gray afternoon in early November, Venetia carried an armful of mended curtains down the back staircase toward the servants' corridor when she heard quiet sobbing from behind the linen closet door. She paused, set the curtains aside, and opened the door gently. Inside, a young kitchen girl named Bridie sat crouched against the shelves, pressing a damp cloth against her swollen wrist. Tears streamed silently down her reddened cheeks. "What happened, sweetheart?" The girl startled, then tried standing quickly. "Nothing, miss. I slipped carrying the copper pot and twisted it badly. But I can still work. Please do not tell Mr. Hale. He will send me home, and my mother needs the wages." Venetia knelt beside her immediately. She took the small wrist carefully between her hands, turning it with practiced gentleness until she understood the injury. "It is not broken, but you mustn't carry anything heavy today. I will speak with Mr. Hale myself. You will not lose your position." The relief that flooded the girl's face was almost painful to witness. Bridie wiped her nose with her sleeve, while Venetia pulled a clean handkerchief from her pocket and pressed it into the child's hand. "Keep this, and come find me if anyone gives you trouble about resting that wrist." She found Mr. Hale in the scullery corridor minutes later, reviewing deliveries with his usual impatience. When Venetia explained that Bridie needed lighter duties for the rest of the week, the head butler frowned deeply. "We are short-staffed already, miss. The Whitmore party requires every hand available. Then reassign her to silver polishing. She can manage that seated. And if anyone questions the arrangement, tell them the instruction came from me." Hale studied Venetia for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, miss." He paused before turning away. "You are the only one in this family who ever asks about the staff, you know." Venetia said nothing to that. She simply returned upstairs to continue preparing guest rooms that nobody would ever associate with her effort. Later that afternoon, when Venetia entered the drawing room to confirm evening arrangements, Lady Dorrance Ashgrove barely looked up from her embroidery. "Where have you been?" "The Whitmore party arrives tomorrow, and the guest chambers on the second floor still smell of camphor." Lady Dorrance threaded her needle with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 30 years issuing commands without expecting resistance. "I was attending to an injured kitchen girl, mother." "A kitchen girl." Lady Dorrance repeated the words as though they tasted strange. "Venetia, you have a peculiar talent for finding the least important task in any room and devoting yourself to it completely." The words struck something deep beneath Venetia's calm exterior. She nodded silently and left the room. That evening, after the rest of the household had retired, Venetia sat alone in the small sitting room near the back garden, the one room nobody else ever used because the fireplace smoked slightly when the wind blew from the east. Saris, her lady's maid, and the closest thing Venetia had to a true friend inside the manor, brought chamomile tea without being asked. "You look tired tonight." "I'm always tired, Ceres." The maid studied her quietly for a moment, before speaking again. "You carry this house on your back, miss, and they step on you for the trouble." Venetia stared at the fire without answering. Outside the window, November rain tapped steadily against the glass, while the rest of the Ashgrove household slept comfortably in rooms she had personally prepared for them. The cruelty inside the Ashgrove estate had not always been this sharp. Before Duke Corwin Blackthorne entered and exited Venetia's life, her family treated her with indifference rather than malice. She existed somewhere between useful and invisible, a convenient presence nobody thought about unless something needed organizing. But after the Duke ended their courtship publicly 1 year ago, indifference transformed into something far worse. Venetia became the family's living embarrassment. Sibella, the second eldest, and the first to marry, had always competed with Venetia quietly. Her husband, Sir Aldous Fenwick, possessed a respectable title but modest wealth, and Sibella resented the limitations this placed on her wardrobe, her social calendar, and her standing among wealthier families. When Venetia had been courted by the Duke of Halford, the wealthiest unmarried nobleman in England, Sibella's jealousy had been barely containable. She smiled through gritted teeth at every dinner where Corwin's name was mentioned, and clapped politely when society praised the match. Then the courtship collapsed, and Sibella's jealousy curdled into something she enjoyed far more: superiority. "At least I secured a husband," she reminded Venetia during a family luncheon one Sunday, while slicing roasted chicken with deliberate calm. "Even a modest match is better than becoming the most pitied woman in Carvingham." Lord Pemberton said nothing to correct her. He chewed his food in silence while Venetia set down her fork and stared at the tablecloth. Sibella's attacks were always delivered with a thin smile, calculated to wound while appearing merely observational. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. Margot operated differently. The third daughter possessed a theatrical cruelty that required an audience. She performed her insults during social gatherings, where guests could witness them, drawing laughter from strangers to amplify the sting. During a dinner party hosted by the Carmichael family 3 months after the Duke's departure, Margot stood beside a group of young women and spoke loudly enough for the entire parlor to hear. "My eldest sister once danced with the Duke of Halford beneath chandeliers at Whitmore Hall. Now she organizes pantry inventories and men's curtains. Life takes the most extraordinary turns, does it not?" The women around her laughed. One covered her mouth with a silk fan. Another glanced toward Venetia with the particular expression people reserve for observing something uncomfortable they feel grateful not to be. Venetia stood near the window, holding a glass of wine she had not sipped once. She said nothing and continued standing there until the conversation moved elsewhere. Like a stone enduring weather, it could not stop. Cosima, the youngest, lacked the subtlety of either sister. Her cruelty was blunt and careless, spoken without calculation, but no less damaging for its thoughtlessness. One morning, while Venetia arranged fresh chrysanthemums in the front hall, Cosima descended the staircase, wrapped in a new velvet shawl purchased from a London dressmaker. "Honestly, Venetia, you spend more time with the flowers than any living person. Perhaps that is why conversation with you feels so terribly botanical." She laughed at her own remark and continued walking toward the breakfast room without pausing. Venetia pressed a thorn into her fingertip accidentally. A small bead of blood appeared. She wiped it away on the inside of her sleeve where nobody would notice. Lord Pemberton's cruelty was the quietest and therefore the heaviest. He did not mock Venetia openly. He simply removed her from consideration entirely. During dinners with important guests, he introduced Sibella, Margot, and Cosima by name, while gesturing vaguely toward Venetia as though she were part of the furniture arrangement. "And my eldest remains at home," he offered once to a visiting baronet, in the same tone someone might use to describe a clock that no longer kept proper time. The baronet nodded uncomfortably and changed the subject. Lady Dorrance contributed a different kind of damage. She had spent years cultivating the Ashgrove reputation through strategic marriages, charitable visibility, and ruthless management of public perception. Venetia's failed courtship with the Duke had cracked that carefully polished surface, and Lady Dorrance treated the crack as a personal offense. She never screamed. She never accused. Instead, she corrected Venetia constantly in small ways that accumulated like stones placed one by one upon a chest. Your posture, Venetia. Straighten your back. People already look at you with pity. Do not give them additional reasons. You wore that gown last month. People notice repetition when they are already watching for signs of decline. Do not speak so freely at dinner. Intelligent conversation from an unmarried woman of your age sounds desperate rather than charming. Each correction arrived with the calm authority of a woman who genuinely believed she was helping. That was what made it unbearable. Lady Dorrance did not think she was being cruel. She thought she was managing a problem. The worst evening came 3 weeks before the Hargreave Winter Ball. Lord Pemberton hosted a private supper for several families connected to his parliamentary ambitions. Venetia had spent the entire day supervising preparations, ensuring the silver was polished, the menu was flawless, the guest rooms were immaculate, and the musicians arrived on schedule. By the time guests were seated, her hands ached, and exhaustion pressed behind her eyes like a weight she could not set down. Halfway through the second course, a visiting countess turned toward Lord Pemberton with polite curiosity. I understand your eldest daughter was once connected to the Duke of Halford. How unfortunate that arrangement did not continue. She must have been devastated. The table went quiet. Lord Pemberton set his wine-glass down slowly. My daughter has many qualities, he said carefully, but the Duke clearly required something she could not provide. The words landed like a closed door. Several guests looked downward. Margot pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. Cosima examined her fingernails. Sibella studied her plate with an expression that almost resembled satisfaction. Venetia sat without moving, while something inside her chest folded inward like paper held too close to flame. She did not leave the table. She did not cry. She finished the meal, excused herself politely, and walked upstairs to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for over an hour without removing her gloves. Saris found her there later, still sitting motionless in the unlit room. Miss Venetia? No answer. Saris lit a candle quietly, then sat beside her on the bed without speaking. For a long time they remained there together in silence, while the rest of the household laughed downstairs over dessert wine and sugared plums, celebrating connections that had nothing to do with the woman who had made the entire evening possible. Before the silence and the shame and the endless gray mornings spent arranging other people's happiness, there had been a spring when Venetia Ashgrove remembered what it felt like to be chosen. She met Duke Corwin Blackthorne at a botanical exhibition in Cheltenham during the second week of April, 18 months before the night that destroyed everything. The exhibition filled a sprawling glass conservatory with rare orchids, climbing jasmine, and tropical ferns imported from expeditions across 3 continents. Venetia had attended alone, having convinced Lady Dorrance that the event carried enough social prestige to justify the carriage journey, though truthfully, she simply wanted to stand among beautiful living things without anyone asking her to organize them. Corwin stood near the east wing examining a species of night-blooming cereus, reading the identification card with the quiet focus of a man genuinely interested rather than performing interest for company. Venetia noticed him only because he was the single person in the conservatory, not speaking to someone else. She paused nearby to study a cluster of pale blue orchids, and without turning fully toward her, he spoke. They only bloom once every 7 years. The Sirius. Most people never see it happen because they are not patient enough to wait. Venetia looked at the plant's closed petals. That must make the bloom more meaningful when it finally arrives. He turned then, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. Sharp features softened slightly by tiredness around the eyes. Dark hair pushed carelessly away from his forehead. An expression that suggested he had expected a polite nod and received something unexpected instead. They spoke for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. Not about titles or estates or family connections, but about patience and observation, and whether beauty required witnesses to exist. Corwin listened to her in a way that made Venetia feel like her thoughts had weight, like the words leaving her mouth mattered beyond politeness. Nobody had listened to her like that in years. The courtship that followed unfolded across the spring and into summer with a warmth that surprised everyone, including Venetia herself. Corwin visited the Ashgrove estate regularly, bringing books he thought she would enjoy, and asking questions about her opinions rather than waiting for her to ask about his. They walked the garden paths behind the manor for hours, discussing philosophy and music and the strange loneliness that could exist inside a crowded room. He played chess with her in the evenings, while her sisters watched from across the drawing room with barely disguised astonishment. No man of Corwin's standing had ever spent that kind of sustained attention on Venetia, and the household adjusted around the new reality like furniture rearranged to accommodate an unexpected guest. Lord Pemberton suddenly praised Venetia at dinners. Lady Dorrance ordered new gowns from London without complaint. Even Sibella managed strained compliments when Corwin was present, though her jaw tightened visibly each time. For the first time since childhood, Venetia felt like she belonged inside her own family. Then summer ended. Lenore Devereux arrived in Carvingham society during the first week of September, accompanying her aunt, the Dowager Countess of Hargreave, for the autumn social season. Lenore possessed the kind of beauty that rearranged rooms upon entry. Pale auburn hair arranged in elaborate curls, wide green eyes that communicated warmth and intelligence simultaneously, and a figure that drew attention from every gentleman within line of sight. But beneath the loveliness lived an ambition as precise and cold as a surgical instrument. Lenore had pursued Corwin Blackthorne unsuccessfully for 2 previous seasons in London. His wealth, his title, his brooding reputation made him the most valuable unmarried man in England, and Lenore had decided years earlier that she deserved him. Discovering that he had given his attention to the quiet, plain eldest daughter of a minor aristocratic family enraged her in ways she concealed beautifully behind gracious smiles. Within 3 weeks, Lenore befriended Margot Ashgrove. Within 4, she had learned everything she needed about the family's internal tensions, Venetia's insecurities, and precisely which pressure points would cause the most damage. The forged letters appeared on the 29th of September. Corwin received them through an anonymous messenger while dining at his London residence. 3 letters, written in handwriting painstakingly crafted to resemble Venetia's, addressed to a minor nobleman named Captain Josiah Crane. The letters described a woman bored with a powerful duke's predictable courtship, amused by his earnestness, and engaged in a passionate secret correspondence with a younger, more exciting man. The words inside those letters were designed to find every wound Corwin carried. His fear of being used for wealth, his suspicion that genuine affection was always performance, his private terror that no woman could love him without ulterior calculation. He believed them instantly. The confrontation happened at the Pemberton autumn dinner, in front of 40 guests, beneath a chandelier Venetia had spent the entire afternoon polishing. Corwin's voice was controlled but devastated. He placed the letters on the table between them without raising his voice, and said words that carved themselves permanently into her memory. "I trusted you with something I have never trusted anyone with, and you performed beautifully. My compliments." Venetia stared at the letters in confusion, then horror, then desperate denial. She had never written them. She had never heard of Captain Josiah Crane. She begged him to listen, to compare the handwriting properly, to consider who might benefit from destroying them. But Corwin was already walking away. The door closed behind him with a sound quieter than thunder, but far more destructive. Venetia stood alone in the center of the dining room, while 40 guests stared at her in silence. Her hands trembled at her sides, her vision blurred, and somewhere across the table, barely visible through the firelight, Lenore Devereaux lifted a glass of wine to her lips and smiled. In the months following the courtship's collapse, the Ashgrove sisters settled into their respective lives with the satisfied confidence of women who believed they had won something permanent. Sibella Fenwick moved through her marriage to Sir Aldous, believing the title alone provided warmth. Their estate in Broughton sat comfortably among rolling farmland, with a stone manor house large enough to host modest dinner parties and a stable that housed 4 well-bred horses Aldous could no longer properly afford. The financial trouble had begun quietly, the way most financial trouble does. First, small debts with tailors went unpaid for longer than expected. Then the wine merchant began requiring payment before delivery, rather than extending the usual quarterly credit. By the time autumn settled over Broughton, Aldous had quietly sold 2 of the horses and dismissed 3 servants without explaining why. Sibella noticed, but refused to acknowledge what the changes meant. Instead, she increased her visits to the Ashgrove estate, arriving in her carriage with gifts purchased on credit and gowns she wore once before they needed returning. She spoke about Aldous with aggressive brightness whenever anyone asked, describing renovations they were planning and parties they intended to host next season, none of which existed beyond her imagination. At night, behind closed doors, the arguments had grown louder. Aldous drank port alone in his study, while Sibella stood outside demanding explanations he refused to give. Twice she discovered letters from creditors hidden inside his desk drawer. Once she found a perfumed note tucked between the pages of a ledger, written in handwriting she did not recognize, signed only with the initial L. She burned the note in the fireplace without confronting him. Acknowledging the affair would require acknowledging that her marriage was collapsing, and Sibella Fenwick would sooner set her own hair on fire than admit publicly that her life had become something worth pitying. So she mocked Venetia harder instead. Every insult directed at her unmarried sister was a wall built between Sibella and the truth she could not face. Margot's success appeared more glamorous on the surface, which made its hollowness more difficult to detect. She had become engaged 3 months earlier to Lord Declan Ware, a wealthy landowner whose family controlled shipping interests along the southern coast. Declan was handsome in the way that portraits of aristocrats are handsome: strong jaw, clear eyes, immaculate clothing, and an expression of permanent mild approval that never deepened into genuine warmth. At social events, Declan performed the role of devoted fiancé with practiced ease. He held Margot's arm as they entered ballrooms, complimented her gowns in front of other women, and laughed at the appropriate moments during conversation. But Margot had begun noticing the distances that lived inside his courtesies. He never asked about her thoughts. He never inquired about her day. He discussed his own interests, politics, shipping tariffs, horse breeding, and expected Margot to listen with admiration rather than contribute. When she once offered an opinion about a parliamentary debate over dinner, Declan smiled patiently and said, "Darling, you are far too pretty to concern yourself with such tedious matters." The table laughed. Margot laughed along. But something tightened behind her ribs that did not release for the rest of the evening. Privately, Declan had already begun correcting her behavior in small ways. He suggested she change her hairstyle because it drew the wrong kind of attention. He recommended she decline invitations from certain friends, whose reputations he considered beneath his standards. He arrived late to their scheduled outings without apology and expected gratitude when he appeared at all. Margot told herself this was how powerful men behaved. She told herself his control was actually protection. She told herself the coldness in his eyes during quiet moments was merely concentration. She told herself everything except the truth. Cosima's engagement had arrived most recently, and with the most spectacle. Percival Grandison, heir to the Grandison textile fortune, proposed during a private dinner at his family's London townhouse with a sapphire ring that Cosima described to anyone willing to listen for approximately 40 minutes. Percival was 23 years old, energetic, generous with compliments, and possessed the emotional maturity of an unattended bonfire. He spent money with abandon, threw elaborate parties that ended with broken furniture, raced carriages through city streets at dangerous speeds, and treated every social gathering as a personal stage. Cosima adored him because his recklessness felt like passion. She mistook volume for depth and extravagance for devotion. When he showered her with jewelry, she believed he was expressing love. When he ignored her for 3 consecutive days to attend horse races with friends, she excused it as youthful energy. What Cosima did not yet know was that Percival had proposed to 2 other women in the previous 18 months. Both engagements ended after the families discovered debts hidden beneath the Grandison fortune's glittering surface. The textile factories were profitable, but Percival's spending had quietly begun outpacing their returns, and his father had grown tired of covering the difference. The sapphire ring was purchased on credit, but inside the Ashgrove household, none of these fractures were visible. The 3 sisters gathered regularly in the drawing room, drinking tea from cups Venetia had organized, and eating biscuits from a kitchen Venetia managed, discussing their bright futures with the unshakable confidence of women who measured success by the men attached to their names. During one such afternoon, with rain streaking down the windows and the fire crackling behind the grate, Cosima set down her teacup and sighed dramatically. "It truly is remarkable," she announced to no one in particular, "how differently things turned out for each of us. Sibella has her title. Margot has her Lord Ware. I have my Percival." She paused and glanced toward the doorway, where Venetia passed, carrying a stack of laundered table linens. "And Venetia has her chrysanthemums." Sibella smiled. Margot examined her engagement ring. Neither corrected the youngest sister. From the corridor, Venetia heard every word. She continued walking without pausing, her arms full of clean linen that smelled of soap and lavender, carrying weight that nobody in the drawing room could see, and nobody in the drawing room cared to acknowledge. That evening, after the household had gone quiet, Caris found Venetia sitting in the garden, despite the cold, staring at the bare branches of the elm tree near the stone wall. "You will catch your death out here, miss. Perhaps that would spare everyone the trouble of pretending I belong here." The words were spoken quietly, without drama, which made them far more painful than if she had shouted them. Saris sat beside her on the cold bench and said nothing for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "You are worth more than any of them know, and someday, someone will prove it." Venetia did not answer, but she did not go inside either. She sat there until the cold became unbearable, then walked upstairs to a bedroom where no one waited for her, and no one would wonder where she had gone. Blackthorn Hall stood on the edge of the Halford coastline, like something carved from grief and granite. The estate sprawled across 300 acres of wind-swept land, overlooking iron-colored cliffs, where the sea threw itself against the rocks, with a violence that matched the silence inside the house. Dark stone walls rose 4 stories high, covered in patches of moss that nobody bothered removing because the Duke had stopped caring about appearances long before the moss arrived. Inside, the manor felt enormous and empty simultaneously. Corridors wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast stretched between rooms that were rarely entered. Fireplaces burned constantly because the staff maintained them, but the warmth never seemed to reach the center of any room where Corwin Blackthorne actually sat. Portraits of previous dukes lined the grand staircase, their painted eyes following visitors who no longer came. The Duke of Halford had become the wealthiest recluse in England. His holdings were staggering. Shipping routes along the northern and eastern coasts generated income that multiplied quarterly. Textile investments in Manchester returned profits that his accountants managed without requiring his attention. Land across 4 counties produced rents that arrived reliably as seasons. Parliament respected his influence even in his absence, and bankers treated correspondence from Blackthorne Hall with the kind of urgency normally reserved for communications from the Crown itself. None of it mattered to him anymore. After the night he walked away from Venetia Ashgrove at the Pemberton autumn dinner, Corwin returned to Halford expecting relief. He expected clarity. He expected the cold satisfaction of protecting himself from another woman's deception. Instead, he found nothing. The relief never arrived. In its place settled a heaviness that attached itself to his chest, like an anchor dropped into deep water. He carried it through breakfast each morning, through the business correspondence he reviewed with mechanical precision each afternoon, and through the long evenings spent alone in his study, while wind howled across the cliffs outside. He replayed the confrontation constantly. Venetia's face when she saw the letters, not guilt, not the panicked expression of someone caught in a lie. Something else entirely. Confusion first, then horror, then a desperate pleading that he had interpreted as performance. But as weeks became months, the interpretation began to fracture. Small details surfaced in his memory, like objects rising slowly through dark water. The handwriting in the letters had resembled Venetia's, but certain flourishes were wrong. The way she crossed her letters was slightly different from the forged versions. The tone of the letters, flirtatious, calculating, almost theatrical, bore no resemblance to the woman who had once told him she found most social conversation exhausting because people rarely said what they actually meant. And then there was Captain Josiah Crane. Corwin had made discreet inquiries after the confrontation and discovered that Crane had been stationed abroad for the entirety of the period the letters supposedly covered. The man had not set foot in England for over a year. Correspondence would have been possible, but physically receiving and sending letters with the frequency the forgeries suggested would have been extraordinarily difficult. These contradictions accumulated quietly inside Corwin's mind, each one a small crack in the certainty he had used to justify destroying the only genuine connection he had ever experienced. Lenore Devereux visited Blackthorne Hall twice during the winter months, arriving with her aunt and a wardrobe clearly selected to impress. She moved through his manor with the comfortable familiarity of a woman already measuring rooms for new curtains. She complimented his estate, praised his taste, laughed at his rare attempts at conversation, and positioned herself beside him at every opportunity with the rehearsed familiarity of someone who had studied proximity. Corwin felt nothing. Where Venetia's presence had once made rooms feel smaller and warmer, Lenore's made them feel staged. Her laughter arrived a half-second too quickly after his words, responding to the fact that he had spoken rather than to what he had said. Her compliments were polished and interchangeable. She praised his library without mentioning a single book. She admired his gardens without knowing the name of anything growing in them. During her second visit, Lenore mentioned Venetia casually over dinner, the way someone might mention weather that had already passed. "I understand Miss Ashgrove has retreated somewhat from society. A pity. though perhaps solitude suits certain temperaments better than company. Something about the smoothness of the observation unsettled him. It was too composed, too neatly delivered, as though the words had been prepared in advance and were being presented at a calculated moment. Corwin studied Lenore's face across the lamplight. She smiled back with perfect warmth, and for the first time, he noticed that her eyes did not match her mouth. After Lenore departed, Corwin sat alone in his study for 3 hours without moving. Rain battered the windows overlooking the cliffs. A glass of whiskey rested untouched beside the fire. On his desk lay the 3 letters that had ended everything, retrieved from the locked drawer where he had buried them months ago. He read them again, then again, then a third time. The woman in those letters wasn't Venetia Ashgrove. He had known it somewhere beneath his anger from the very beginning. But admitting that meant admitting something far more painful than betrayal. It meant admitting that he had destroyed an innocent woman because his own fear was louder than his judgment. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Helene, found him still sitting there the following morning, unshaven and hollow-eyed, staring at the letters spread across the desk. "You look dreadful." "I have made a terrible mistake, Mother." Helene studied her son for a long moment. She had watched him withdraw from the world over the past year with the quiet anguish of a woman who understood that some wounds could only be healed by the person who received them, not the person who inflicted them. Then perhaps it is time to stop hiding from it. 3 days later, an invitation arrived from the Dowager Countess of Hargreave for the annual Hargreave Winter Ball. Under ordinary circumstances, Corwin would have placed it unopened on the pile of ignored correspondence growing steadily beside his desk. But this invitation carried an additional note, written in the Countess's own hand. "The Ashgrove family will be attending." Corwin held the card for several minutes while the fire cracked quietly beside him. Then he called for his valet and instructed him to prepare his formal coat. The journey from Halford to Carvingham took nearly 6 hours by carriage through frozen countryside. Corwin spent the entire journey in silence, watching bare trees pass the frosted windows while rehearsing words he knew would be inadequate for the damage he had caused. He did not know what he would say to her. He did not know if she would allow him to speak at all. But as the distant lights of the Hargreave estate appeared through the winter darkness ahead, one thing became painfully, undeniably clear. He had spent a year punishing a woman for a crime she never committed, and every moment of her suffering had been his fault. The Hargreave Winter Ball occupied every room of the Countess's estate, with a grandeur designed to remind lesser families of their position. The main ballroom alone stretched nearly the full length of the east wing, its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of mythological triumph, while 4 crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung above a floor polished to such perfection that dancers appeared to move across dark water. Garlands of winter holly and white roses wrapped every marble pillar, filling the air with a fragrance that competed against the warmth of roasted meats, buttered pastries, mulled wine, and sugared fruits arranged across silver trays on tables lining the walls. The crowd filled the space. Women in silk and satin and embroidered velvet moved between conversation circles, while gentlemen discussed trade, politics, and the quiet scandals that made winter gatherings tolerable. An orchestra played softly beneath the far balcony, their music blending with laughter and the steady clink of crystal glasses lifted and set down and lifted again. Venetia stood near the eastern wall beside a stone column wrapped in holly, holding a glass of wine she had no intention of drinking. Her gown was simple compared to the elaborate creations surrounding her. Pale gray silk with no embroidery, no jewels at the neckline, no pearls threaded through her dark hair. Lady Dorrance had chosen it deliberately, nothing too fine for a daughter who no longer warranted investment. Across the ballroom, her sisters occupied the center of attention with effortless confidence. Sibella laughed beside Sir Aldous, who had already emptied his glass twice, his cravat loosened, despite the evening barely beginning. Margot held Lord Declan's arm, while accepting compliments from women who admired her engagement ring with the exaggerated enthusiasm that polite society required. Cosima moved between groups trailing Percival, whose booming voice carried across the room each time he told a story nobody had asked to hear. Venetia watched them all from her position near the wall and felt the deep exhaustion of someone standing inside a celebration that had nothing to do with her. Then a disturbance near the refreshment table drew her attention. A young footman, barely older than 16, had stumbled while carrying a heavy silver tray of mulled wine. Several glasses tilted dangerously, spilling dark liquid across the white linen tablecloth and splashing the hem of a nearby woman's gown. The woman recoiled with visible disgust. Clumsy fool. This gown cost more than your yearly wages. The boy's face drained of color. His hand shook so violently that the remaining glasses rattled against the tray. He began stammering apologies, while trying to blot the stain with a cloth already soaked through, making everything worse. Venetia crossed the distance without thinking. She reached the boy before anyone else moved, gently took the tray from his trembling hands, and set it on the table behind them. "Breathe," she said quietly, close enough that only he could hear. "Look at me. You are fine. Spilled wine is not the end of the world, no matter what anyone tells you." The boy's breathing steadied slightly. Venetia turned toward the offended woman with a composure that belied the anxiety still humming beneath her own skin. "I am certain the young man meant no harm. Winter floors become slippery with so many guests. Perhaps a fresh napkin would help with the hem." She gestured to another servant, who hurried forward with clean linen. The situation dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the woman accepting the napkin with a stiff nod, the boy retreating gratefully toward the kitchen corridor. Nobody applauded. Nobody noticed particularly, except as a minor interruption in an evening full of more interesting things. But one person noticed. Corwin Blackthorne stood 30 feet away, half concealed by the crowd near the main entrance, having arrived moments earlier without announcement, because he had instructed the herald to delay. He had wanted a moment to observe before his presence rearranged the room. And in that moment, he had watched Venetia protect a frightened boy with the same instinctive gentleness he remembered from the conservatory in Cheltenham, from the garden paths behind the Ashgrove estate, from every quiet afternoon when she had shown him who she truly was before he chose to believe a lie instead. Something cracked open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for a year. Then the herald's staff struck the marble floor. His Grace, Duke Corwin Blackthorne of Halford. The effect was immediate and violent. Conversations died mid-sentence. The orchestra stumbled into uncertain silence. 300 heads turned toward the entrance simultaneously, while the air inside the ballroom seemed to compress and hold its breath. Corwin stepped forward into the chandelier light, his dark, formal coat sharp against the golden glow surrounding him. His expression carried nothing performative, no charm arranged for public consumption, no practiced smile, only the quiet intensity of a man who had traveled 6 hours through frozen countryside for a single purpose. Sibella's wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth. Margot gripped Lord Declan's arm so tightly he winced. Cosima whispered something to Percival that nobody else heard. Lady Dorance's posture straightened with the reflexive urgency of a woman sensing either opportunity or catastrophe. Lord Pemberton stepped forward immediately, extending his hand with the eager warmth of a man who had once benefited enormously from the Duke's proximity to his family and hoped desperately to do so again. "Your Grace, what an extraordinary surprise. We are deeply honored by your presence this evening." Corwin accepted the handshake without warmth. Lord Pemberton. Then his eyes moved past the outstretched hand, past the eager smile, past the crowd of beautifully dressed strangers watching him with fascination, and found Venetia. She stood exactly where she had been standing before, beside the stone column wrapped in holly, her gray silk gown nearly invisible among the brighter colors surrounding her. Her face carried no expression he could read from this distance, but her hands, still holding the untouched glass of wine, had begun trembling. Corwin walked toward her. The crowd parted without being asked. Guests stepped aside instinctively, the way people move for someone whose direction carries the weight of inevitability. Whispers ignited instantly behind fans and gloved hands. He is walking toward her. After everything that happened, is he truly approaching the woman he publicly humiliated? Venetia did not move. She could not. Her body had locked into place the moment his name was announced, and now every step he took toward her pulled the breath from her chest until breathing required conscious effort. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, close enough to see the year of suffering written across features he had once told her were the most honest face in any room. "Miss Ashgrove," he said quietly. His voice carried just enough for nearby guests to hear, though the words clearly belonged only to her. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but if you would permit me one dance, I would be grateful beyond any words I am capable of speaking tonight." The ballroom held its breath. Venetia stared at him for what felt like a century, compressed into several seconds. Behind her eyes, a war raged between the memory of the woman she had been when she loved him and the wreckage of the woman he had left behind. Then, she set her wine glass down on the ledge beside the column. "One dance, Your Grace?" Nothing more. The orchestra began a slow waltz as Corwin guided her carefully onto the floor. His hand rested against hers, with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation, as though he understood that the woman he was touching had been handled carelessly by the world and could not withstand more of the same. They danced in near silence, while 300 guests watched without blinking. "You have no idea how sorry I am," he said quietly, barely above the music. Venetia's expression did not change. "You are right. I have no idea. Because you never came back to tell me." The words struck him with the precision of something she had carried for 12 months, sharpened by every sleepless night and every unanswered question, and every moment she spent wondering what she had done wrong. Corwin absorbed the blow without looking away from her face. "I know. And I intend to explain everything if you will let me." The dance ended. Venetia released his hand and stepped backward, her composure intact but fragile, like porcelain that had been glued back together and could not survive another fall. "Good night, Your Grace." She turned and walked toward the corridor without looking back. Corwin stood alone on the ballroom floor, while whispers spread around him like fire finding dry wood. And across the room, watching from behind a crystal glass of champagne, Lenore Devereaux felt something cold settle into the bottom of her stomach. Corwin did not leave Carvingham after the ball. He took rooms at the Hargreave Coaching Inn 3 miles from the Ashgrove estate and sent a carefully written letter the following morning, requesting permission to call upon Venetia. The letter was addressed to Lord Pemberton, as protocol demanded, but its contents made clear that the visit concerned his eldest daughter exclusively. Lord Pemberton's response arrived within 2 hours. The eagerness of the acceptance was almost embarrassing. The first visit lasted 20 minutes. Venetia received him in the drawing room with Saris present as chaperone, her back straight and her expression guarded in ways that made the distance between them feel wider than the actual room. She answered his questions politely but briefly. She did not smile. She did not ask questions of her own. When he rose to leave, She stood immediately with the relieved posture of someone who had been holding her breath underwater. The second visit, 2 days later, lasted slightly longer. Corwin brought a book of botanical illustrations he had purchased in London, a volume documenting the night-blooming cereus and 17 other species that flower rarely and unpredictably. He set it on the table between them without commentary. Venetia looked at the book for a long time before picking it up. She turned several pages in silence while Corwin sat across from her, making no attempt to fill the quiet with conversation. He understood that trust, once shattered, could not be reconstructed with words. Only patience had any chance. By the third visit, Venetia asked her first question. "Why did you believe those letters without speaking to me first?" The directness of it struck him physically. He sat forward in his chair and answered honestly. "Because I was afraid that what we had was too good to be real. And when evidence appeared confirming that fear, I chose the explanation that hurt less than the alternative." "What alternative?" "That you were genuine, and that I was simply not brave enough to deserve it." Venetia studied his face for several seconds. Then she looked away toward the window, where frost patterns climbed the glass like silver ivy. She did not forgive him that afternoon, but she did not ask him to stop visiting either. Inside the Ashgrove household, the Duke's reappearance detonated quietly. Sibella cornered Lady Dorrance in the morning room the day after his second visit, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "He is toying with her. No man returns after publicly destroying a woman unless he wants something." Lady Dorrance adjusted her embroidery without looking up. Or perhaps he has reconsidered. Stranger things have happened. The measured calm in her mother's voice enraged Sibella further, because she recognized it immediately. Lady Dorrance was calculating again. The same woman who had called Venetia an embarrassment 6 weeks ago was now quietly repositioning herself to benefit from whatever the Duke's renewed attention might produce. Margot's reaction was more strategic. During a morning walk with Lord Declan through the frost-covered gardens, she mentioned casually that Venetia seemed to be entertaining the Duke's visits again. Declan raised an eyebrow. Blackthorn? The man who humiliated her publicly? The very same. Margot paused to examine a frozen rosebud with exaggerated interest. "I worry for my sister, of course. A woman in her position might confuse pity with genuine affection." The implication was clear. Margot wanted Declan to spread doubt through his social circles, and Declan, who enjoyed gossip the way some men enjoyed hunting, obliged willingly. Within a week, drawing rooms across Carvingham buzzed with speculation about whether the Duke's visits represented real remorse or merely a powerful man's boredom during winter. Cosima contributed her own damage with characteristic bluntness. During afternoon tea at the Ashgrove estate, while Corwin waited in the drawing room for Venetia to arrive, Cosima passed the open doorway and spoke loudly enough to be heard inside. It must be flattering for Venetia, having a wealthy man pay attention again. Beggars cannot choose their benefactors, I suppose. The silence that followed was absolute. Corwin set down his teacup without expression. Cosima continued walking, oblivious to the cold fury settling behind the Duke's eyes. But the true threat arrived from outside the family. Lenore Devereux learned of Corwin's renewed visits through Margot, who wrote to her with the breathless urgency of a woman desperate for an ally. Lenore read the letter in her London townhouse, sitting before a vanity mirror while a maid arranged her auburn hair, and felt genuine fear for the first time in years. If Corwin reconnected with Venetia, questions would inevitably surface about how the courtship originally collapsed, and questions about the forged letters would eventually lead back to the woman who had commissioned them. Lenore traveled to Carvingham within 3 days. She arranged a dinner invitation through her aunt, the Dowager Countess, and arrived at the Ashgrove estate, wearing deep blue velvet trimmed with silver thread, her beauty calibrated to maximum effect. Throughout the evening, She positioned herself near Corwin with the casual persistence of ivy climbing toward sunlight. "You seem different," she told him during a quiet moment near the fireplace, her voice carrying manufactured warmth. "More uncertain than I remember. I preferred the man who trusted his own judgment." The words were designed precisely. They targeted the same insecurity the forged letters had exploited. The fear that trusting someone meant surrendering control. The suspicion that vulnerability was weakness disguised as love. Corwin looked at her steadily. "My judgment nearly destroyed an innocent woman. I am not certain it deserves the trust I once gave it." Lenore's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Later that evening, while guests moved between the dining room and the drawing room for after-dinner conversation, Corwin excused himself briefly and walked toward the library to retrieve a document Lord Pemberton had requested. As he passed the partially open door of the morning room, voices stopped him. Sibella spoke first. The letters worked perfectly the first time. If he is becoming suspicious, perhaps additional evidence could be arranged. Margot's voice followed immediately. Lenore mentioned she still has connections who could produce correspondence. Something more damning this time, perhaps involving financial arrangements rather than romantic ones. Corwin's entire body went rigid. He stood motionless in the corridor for several seconds, processing what he had just heard with the devastating clarity of a man watching the final piece of a broken mechanism fall into place. The letters had been fabricated. His sisters had known. And Lenore had orchestrated the entire destruction of his courtship with Venetia. Every night Venetia had spent crying alone in her room. Every insult she had absorbed from her own family. Every whisper that followed her through society for 12 months. All of it constructed deliberately by people standing 20 feet away from him, planning to do it again. Corwin pushed the door open. Sibella and Margot froze instantly. The color drained from their faces simultaneously, like someone had pulled a plug beneath their confidence and watched it empty onto the floor. "You will explain," Corwin said quietly, his voice so controlled that it frightened them more than shouting ever could. "Exactly what was done to your sister, and you will explain it now." Neither woman spoke. He stepped further into the room. Venetia Ashgrove endured a year of cruelty, isolation, and humiliation because people inside her own family conspired with a woman whose jealousy mattered more to them than their sister's life. And you sat across the table from her every evening, watching her suffer for something she never did, and said nothing. Margot's hands began shaking. "You will tell her the truth, both of you, tomorrow morning. Or I will ensure that every drawing room, every club, and every newspaper in London learns precisely what the Ashgrove family and Lenore Devereux did to an innocent woman." He turned and left the room. Venetia was standing in the corridor near the staircase when he emerged, clearly having come looking for him. She saw his expression and stopped walking. "What happened?" Corwin crossed the distance between them and stopped close enough that his voice would not carry beyond the two of them. "The letters were forged. Your sisters knew. Lenore Devereux arranged everything." Venetia stared at him. For several seconds her expression held perfectly still, her mind processing information too heavy to produce an immediate physical response. Then something behind her eyes collapsed, not into sadness, but into the particular devastation of having a suspicion she had buried for 12 months, confirmed aloud by the one person whose belief mattered most. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "You believe me now?" 3 words carrying 12 months of unanswered agony. Corwin's steadiness broke for the first time. "I should have believed you then." Venetia pressed her hand against the corridor wall to steady herself. Tears she had spent a year refusing to shed in front of anyone began falling silently down her cheeks, not dramatically, not with sobs, but with the quiet relentlessness of something that could no longer be contained. Corwin did not touch her. He did not attempt comfort he had not yet earned the right to offer. He stood beside her in the dim corridor, while candlelight flickered against the walls, sharing the weight of a grief he had caused and she had carried alone. And from behind the morning room door, Sibella and Margot listened to their sister's quiet weeping and understood for the first time the full measure of what they had done. 6 weeks after the truth surfaced, London society gathered for the Marchioness of Ashworth's spring reception, the most prestigious annual event of the early season. The Ashworth estate in Mayfair glittered with enough crystal and candlelight to illuminate a small village. 5 chandeliers hung from ceilings, painted with scenes of celestial glory, while the scent of imported lilies, roasted quail, honeyed figs, champagne, and warm vanilla pastries layered the air inside the ballroom so thickly that breathing felt like consumption. 400 guests filled the space. Women in gowns worth small fortunes moved between conversation circles, while gentlemen positioned themselves near political allies and financial prospects. Ambassadors nodded to earls. Bankers smiled at duchesses. The entire machinery of English power and beauty and ambition operated at full speed beneath one gilded roof. Venetia Ashgrove arrived beside Lady Dorrance, wearing a gown of deep ivory silk that caught the candlelight in ways her family had never bothered to dress her before. No jewelry except a single strand of freshwater pearls resting against her collarbone. Her dark hair was arranged simply. She looked precisely like what she had always been, quietly beautiful in ways that required attention to notice and sincerity to appreciate. The weeks since Corwin's confrontation with her sisters had transformed the interior of the Ashgrove household into something unrecognizable. Sibella and Margot had confessed to Venetia the following morning, sitting across from her in the drawing room with expressions that carried shame and resentment in equal measure. The confession was incomplete and self-serving, emphasizing Lenore's role while minimizing their own, but the essential truth emerged clearly enough. Venetia listened without interrupting. When they finished, she stood, said nothing, and left the room. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stopped speaking to either sister unless household matters absolutely required it. The silence was more devastating than any confrontation could have been, because it forced Sibella and Margot to sit inside the consequences of their actions without the relief of being forgiven. Lord Pemberton, upon learning the full details, retreated into his study for an entire afternoon and emerged looking older than he had that morning. Lady Dorrance said nothing publicly, but began treating Venetia with a careful gentleness that arrived far too late to undo years of damage. Corwin, meanwhile, had spent those 6 weeks proving that his remorse was not theoretical. He wrote to Venetia 3 times each week. Not love letters, not grand declarations. Simple, honest correspondence that described his days, asked about hers, and acknowledged without self-pity the damage his cowardice had caused. He visited when invited and never pressured her for forgiveness she was not ready to give. He brought small gifts, a pressed flower from the Cheltenham Conservatory, a first edition of a philosophy text she had once mentioned admiring, a sketch of the night-blooming Sirius he had commissioned from a botanical artist in London. Slowly, painfully, something began rebuilding between them. Not the effortless warmth of their original courtship, but something deeper and more deliberate, a connection tested by failure and choosing to continue despite it. Venetia's guard lowered in increments so small they were nearly invisible. A half-smile during a walk, a question about his mother's health that revealed she had been thinking about him between visits, a moment during tea when her hand rested near his on the table and neither of them moved it away. She had not told him she forgave him. She had not told him she loved him. But she had stopped asking him to leave. Now, inside the Ashworth Ballroom, Venetia stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the spectacle with the quiet detachment of someone who had learned long ago that grand events rarely included her in their plans. Across the room, Lenore Devereaux stood in scarlet silk and rubies, surrounded by admirers whose attention she absorbed like sunlight, striking polished stone. She had not seen Corwin since the confrontation at the Ashgrove estate, and her presence tonight carried the defiant energy of a woman who believed her beauty and connections would protect her from consequences indefinitely. Then the crowd near the entrance shifted, and Corwin Blackthorne entered the ballroom. He wore black. No decoration except the Halford family crest, pinned discreetly at his collar. His expression carried the focused stillness of a man who had made a decision during the carriage ride and intended to execute it before doubt could intervene. In his left hand, barely visible against the dark fabric of his coat, he held a small velvet box. Whispers erupted immediately. Women who had spent years pursuing his attention straightened instinctively. Mothers gripped daughters' arms. Lenore's chin lifted with renewed confidence, her crimson gown catching the light as she prepared to position herself in his path. Corwin walked directly past her without a glance. He moved through the crowd with a certainty that parted guests like water dividing around the prow of a ship. He passed Lady Ashworth herself. He passed 3 countesses, 2 ambassadors' wives, and a row of young women whose beauty had been carefully prepared for exactly this kind of moment. He stopped in front of Venetia. The ballroom fell silent for the second time in their lives. 400 guests watched as Duke Corwin Blackthorne, the wealthiest and most reclusive nobleman in England, opened the velvet box before a woman's society had spent a year calling damaged, discarded, and unwanted. Inside the box, a single diamond rested on pale blue satin. No sapphire clusters, no elaborate settings. A stone of extraordinary clarity, chosen because it reflected light honestly rather than bending it into something it was not. Venetia's breath stopped entirely. Corwin spoke clearly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, because what he was about to say was not private. It was a correction delivered to every person who had ever whispered about the woman standing before him. Miss Venetia Ashgrove, 1 year ago I stood in a room full of people and accused you of something you never did. I believed a lie because believing it was easier than trusting something real. And in doing so, I caused more harm to a woman of greater worth than anyone in that room, including myself, deserved to stand beside. Nobody breathed. You endured a year of cruelty from your own family without becoming cruel yourself. You were mocked by your sisters, and you never retaliated. You were dismissed by your parents, and you continued caring for their household without recognition. You were abandoned by the man who claimed to value you, and instead of becoming bitter, you knelt beside a frightened servant boy at a winter ball and told him that spilled wine was not the end of the world. Sibella, standing 40 feet away, pressed her hand against her stomach as though physically struck. Margot lowered her eyes to the floor. Cosima stood frozen beside Percival, her usual confidence shattered into silence. Lenore Devereaux's face had gone entirely white. Corwin continued, his voice steady, but carrying an emotion that made several nearby women press handkerchiefs against their eyes. I have spent my life surrounded by people who performed kindness for advantage, who offered loyalty with conditions attached, and who treated love as currency to be exchanged for status. You are the only person I have ever known who possesses genuine goodness without requiring anything in return. And I was too frightened to recognize it when it stood directly in front of me. He stepped closer. I am not asking you to forget what I did. I am not asking you to pretend the past year did not happen. I am asking you, before every person in this room who ever doubted your worth, to allow me the rest of my life to prove that I understand what I nearly lost." He held the ring forward. "Venetia, will you honor me by becoming my wife?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but inside those seconds lived an entire year of suffering. Every unanswered prayer, every night spent crying in unlit rooms, every morning she woke and forced herself to continue existing inside a family that treated her like a stain on their reputation. Tears fell openly down her cheeks. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her mouth opened twice before sound emerged. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, but somehow heard by every person in the ballroom, she answered, "Yes." The applause that erupted shook the chandeliers. Women who had whispered about Venetia for months now wept openly. Men who had dismissed her existence nodded with the quiet respect that witnessing genuine courage produces in even the most cynical observers. Corwin slid the ring onto her trembling finger, while his own hand shook in ways he made no effort to hide. Across the ballroom, Lenore Devereaux set down her champagne glass quietly and walked toward the exit without speaking to anyone. Nobody followed her, and near the back of the room, half hidden behind a marble pillar, Ceres stood with both hands pressed against her mouth and tears streaming freely down her face, watching the woman she had believed in long before anyone else finally receive what she had always deserved. Years passed after that evening. As Duchess of Halford, Venetia transformed Blackthorn Hall from a fortress of silence into something that breathed. She opened the estate to local families during winter months, providing warm meals and shelter when storms made the coastal roads impassable. She established a fund for educating servants' children, personally selecting books, and visiting the small schoolroom she built inside the estate's east wing every Thursday morning. She learned the name of every worker on the grounds, from the head gardener to the boy who polished boots beside the stable entrance, and treated each with the same quiet respect that had always defined her character. People across the county began speaking about the Duchess of Halford with genuine admiration, not because of her title or her husband's wealth, but because her kindness felt real. It arrived without conditions, without performance, without the careful calculation that society normally attached to charitable behavior. Corwin watched the transformation of his home and his life with the humbled gratitude of a man who understood precisely how close he had come to losing everything that now mattered to him. He never forgot what he had done. Venetia never pretended it had not happened. But between those two truths, they built something stronger than the effortless romance they had once shared. They built a marriage forged from honesty, tested by failure, and held together by the deliberate choice to remain rather than the naive assumption that remaining was easy. Meanwhile, the fragile successes of the Ashgrove sisters collapsed with the same inevitability that cracks in stone eventually become fractures. Sir Aldous Fenwick's financial ruin became public during the second winter after the wedding. Creditors seized the Broughton estate. The remaining horses were sold at auction, and Sibella found herself living in rented rooms in a market town she once would have refused to visit. Aldous disappeared to the continent with his mistress, leaving nothing behind except debts and a letter that offered neither apology nor explanation. Margot's marriage to Lord Declan Ware lasted 14 months before the coldness she had once rationalized as sophistication revealed itself as permanent indifference. Declan treated her as a decorative extension of his political ambitions, appearing together at public functions while maintaining entirely separate lives in private. When Margot once asked him directly whether he loved her, he looked up from his newspaper and said, "I married appropriately. Love was never part of the arrangement." She moved back to her childhood bedroom at the Ashgrove estate without telling anyone the reason. Cosima's engagement to Percival Grandison ended in public embarrassment, when the Grandison family's debts surfaced in a London financial paper. The sapphire ring was quietly returned. Percival married an heiress from Birmingham 3 months later, without contacting Cosima again. Lenore Devereaux's reputation survived longer than it deserved, sustained by beauty and social connections that insulated her from immediate consequences. But truth, once loosened, tends to find its way through even the most carefully constructed defenses. Within 2 years, the story of the forged letters had spread through enough drawing rooms that invitations began arriving less frequently. Within 3, she had relocated to Paris, where nobody knew her history and where she could begin the exhausting work of constructing a new reputation from scratch. One autumn afternoon, several years after the wedding, 3 familiar carriages arrived at Blackthorn Hall. Venetia watched from the upstairs window as her sisters emerged one by one. Their gowns were simpler now. Their postures carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the journey and everything to do with the lives they had built on foundations that could not hold weight. She met them in the drawing room beside the fireplace, where afternoon light fell warmly across the carpets and the scent of baking bread drifted from the kitchen below. None of her sisters could meet her eyes easily. Sibella spoke first, her voice stripped of the polished confidence that once made her insults feel effortless. "We came because we had nowhere else to go, and because you are the only person who might still be willing to receive us." The room held its breath. Venetia looked at each of her sisters in turn. She saw the years of cruelty written across their faces, not as guilt performed for her benefit, but as genuine exhaustion left behind by the slow collapse of everything they had once valued above her. Then she called for tea, because in the end, the greatest strength was never proving them wrong. It was remaining kind long after kindness stopped being easy. And the world eventually learned what the Ashgrove family discovered too late. That real worth was never measured by the ring on a woman's finger or the title attached to her name, but by the grace she carried inside her heart when every reason for bitterness had been handed to her freely, and she chose not to accept a single one.